Grandmother forced my dad on street underage, later tried to move in. I just listened to this story in a casual conversation of my elderly relatives, and it is a nasty shock. I asked my mom, and it is true. Only they told me a censored version. I knew my grandparents told my dad to move out when he was young, but the version my dad told me was it happened when he finished high school and applied for a job. Real version is worse. My grandmother married young and had my dad 6 months after the wedding. Back then you were expecting, you married after parents of both parties made a deal. So this happened here. When my dad was born, his father went to party because he had a son. And when my dad was 6 days old, there was an accident. His dad on a bike versus a truck. Truck's driver survived. There was no insurance because my grandfather was very drunk. So the situation for my grandmother wasn't easy. No job, no money, infant. When my dad was 7, his grandparents arranged a marriage for their daughter. My step-grandfather was scared of being a father as a young adult, but did whatever possible with his limited resources. My grandmother got odd jobs, went drunk, got fired. It happened so many times that later they decided she was to stay home and take care of her kids. My dad was a replacement parent for his step-siblings. Here is where it gets bad. When my dad was 16 and in high school, he wasn't a bad student. His younger brothers and sister were bad students. One of his younger brothers wasn't promoted to next class in elementary school. My grandmother got mad and forced my dad out. Take your clothes and get out. And she screamed at him, "We will see how long you stay in high school now." Back then there were laws that kids were to stay in school till they were 18 and it was illegal to hire a minor. My dad got some odd jobs. Parents of his school mates let him stay for several weeks. One of his teachers let him stay. And got a lawyer to check if emancipation was allowed in this case. My grandmother went to court and lied. She never had forced him out, but he was a bad son. Always drinking, bad grades. Always playing truant, beating his siblings and so on. That trachea had school records of my dad and somehow records of his siblings, but still no emancipation. Judge was in position to force my grandmother to take my dad in, but refused. My step-grandfather promised and delivered money every month. He was a better parent than my grandmother. Dad finished that high school and there was talk about university, but then got a job, found a place to stay, met my mom. After the wedding, they first lived with my grandparents. Supposedly many times strangers arrived asking for money my drinking relatives were supposed to pay. It ended when my parents got their own place. Several years of no contact, and my stepfather died. They owned a flat that my grandmother inherited, no mortgage. Also, she had no retirement money because she mostly didn't work, but according to our law had 80% of her husband's retirement money. So it was all set. She contacted my dad once to tell him he would never get that flat and his stepfather's money. So there. Fast forward more years and suddenly a clerk from a hospital calls. My grandmother had diabetes. Never treated, she kept drinking. More. She had money for vodka, but not for utilities and rent. Got many notifications, ignored, drunk more. At a certain point was so in debt that it was more than the value of her flat, so she lost it. Her good kids had money for vodka, but not for their mom. Her only daughter was married and wanted to take a credit, bail my grandmother, and get that flat for her own kids. My grandmother didn't sign a contract for that flat. Just give me money and I will pay my debts. So my uncle blocked the transaction. First, he wanted to help and pay, but not to give money when my grandmother takes all and promises to pay. So she lost that flat, and some friends took her in. She badmouthed my dad and her daughter and son-in-law. Then one friend saw her real character, asked another person to take her in, then another and another. The last person returns home, and my grandmother and some of her sons are there drinking and many valuable items missing. That person said nothing. because they were one person versus several drinking, but waited, and when the sons went away, they called paramedics for an elderly lady with diabetes. She wasn't lucid, and they weren't sure it was diabetes or all the alcohol. Cops arrived, too, and tried to blame that host. They had a recording of themselves begging the sons not to share alcohol with my grandmother. So cops couldn't arrest the host. Paramedics took my Gramdmother to hospital. She lost both legs. Hospital kept her for several weeks, and she gave my parents' address as her own. So a clerk called my parents. They had to show all the documents and explain my grandmother herself went no contact, took credits for my dad, kept money he had to pay back, took a home her parents left for him, and more. Hospital couldn't demand my parents accept her. Actually, my dad wanted to, but my mom asked, "What will you do when your mom invites your brothers and one of them is so drunk that he kills me or our daughter, me?" None of good sons took her in. Hospital clerks tried to put her in a home for elderly, but it didn't work. There was a rule: no alcohol, which she disregarded. She invited her sons. They had vodka. Some items went missing from many rooms. You know the drill. Her daughter took her in, and they moved to another place. They were to live with parents of son-in-law. That was the official reason. But it was 180 kilometers from our city, and there was hope all the stepbrothers of my dad wouldn't visit. They had no jobs, some money from Adult Protective Services, which used for vodka. They never visited. Promised a lot. Never got to it. I know my parents visited several times and left some money that my uncle took. Not for himself, but for money, some medical supplies, or to hire a nurse. He told them my aunt would give them money to her mother, and she would drink. My grandmother died there and was buried locally. All her good sons went to her funeral and then started a huge quarrel. They demanded money from my parents and my aunt and uncle. You see, all four took pension money and got so rich, explaining that it all went to nurses and medical equipment didn't work. Emotionally abusive father who's basically ruined my mom's life. I have a father who has always been so abusive to my mom. Brought her here illegally, meanwhile he comes here legally. This was back in the 90s. How loose immigration was. Won't let her get adjusted status. Basically the textbook definition of emotional abuse. He's next to it. He's kept her from speaking to her parents, refused to let her call home. Her mom died while she was in a new country because she couldn't go back home, and overall, he just sucks. There's so much more, but it'd be an essay, and I'd start crying. Anyway, witnessing this abuse, both his sons became defiant, and one ran away from home robbing him. The other is a college dropout with dead-end gigs who's just as narcissistic and mentally deranged as him, while my poor mother attends to them and blames herself. Anyway, my dad has called all his children worthless pieces of trash, and how he ruined us, and how none of us talk to him because he's a B-word for corrupting us. Mind you, my earliest memory is of my mother sobbing while he screamed at her. Mind you, I'm the only sane kid who has graduated college working on my 3rd degree, and it'll never be enough. Anyway, he also kinda ruined my life. I can't really say it here, but I don't owe him anything. His parents forced him to marry her, and he takes out that resentment on my mom. I can't care for her BC of school right now, and frankly, how can I when her status is bullshit BC? He ruined it, and she'd trigger the 10-year bar if she were to go home and adjust, and she can't BC. What's there to go home to? Anyway, F my father and F his parents and hope they rot due to his sins, and every time he calls my mom a B-word because she isn't his lap slave. A weak C-word of a man. My mother-in-law can be very awful. Venting out with this long story short, this morning my hubby and close family friends with their baby daughter had been involved in probably in our first, and hopefully last, serious crash on highway. A full-loaded lorry just bulldozed us while we were on the shoulder for a driver change. Now I know why bro told us to never stop on the shoulder unless for a car failure or emergency. Dad and my bigger brother were driving different cars, and they were the first to respond to our crash. Bro is an E, our medic who loves working on ambulances, medical car, and hello. Dad is a former combat medic, since we're traveling as a convoy. We were on our way for a small weekend break. They secured the scene, Bro evaluated our condition. Dad was relaying to the dispatcher Bro's assessments, and they both gave us a first aid till the paramedics arrived. Once arrived at the nearest ED, they gave a code 2 and sent us in a room for observation. Here started the drama. For only God knows reason, my Emile started berating my bro for not being in hurry or not acting as in movies, like yelling orders, rushing head down to the wreckage, and other cliché. She said to him, "You are too relaxed. How can you be so calm in such situation? Do you even care?" Dear Emile, my bro in the field since he was 16 years old. Now he is 33, as EMT, then paramedic, and then an our medic. I'm pretty sure he saw even worse scenes than us. At least, we could walk out from the wreckage on our feet once cleared by paramedics. I goddamn know and understand why they act so cold. She started questioning why Dad and him didn't try to extricate us. Then she started with the cliché, if it was for me, if I was them, I would have done this. I would have done that. And other bullshits. I wouldn't be surprised if she had tried to direct bro and dad job by trying, or even worse, by lying to the cops about the crash dynamics. If it was for her, she probably would have killed us in some way, lol. Friends and relatives came to visit us, and guess what? She tried to get the credit for everything. She was literally showboating and gloating on how her help was crucial, like she did everything. I heard our cousin saying, "Thank God Uncle and Coos were there." Man, my Emile's voice cracked, saying it was her knowledge of what? That saved us. I'm pretty sure none of them believed at her bullshit since she is known to be creative while telling facts. But still, I was so livid and embarrassed because I know how my bro is proud of his work, but as usual, he said nothing because it's not worth arguing with a crazy-ass narcissist. Just let her have her 15 minutes of glory. Same for Dad. They shrugged it off. Hearing this, my husband started crying from the embarrassment and frustration. He kept saying to me, "It's not fair. Dad and bro did everything. I know bro's efforts in his job. On the field, he is the one who I trust the most to cover my back. Hubby is a firefighter. They met on the field. I never seen him so embarrassed by his mom behavior." I could feel his frustration. How I would love to slap that woman across her face. After eavesdropping that witch, Dad and bro just walked out from our room like nothing to update our fams and friends of our conditions. They let Emile having all glory. First report, according my bro, says the trucker admitted to have fallen asleep while driving. Substances and alcohol tests were negative. By the way, luckily, we got the green lights from the ED medical staff to get back home. Dad and bro told us we will be very, very sore for the next following days. Update. We're at home and the soreness is draining our energies. Local PD called us telling the trucker took full responsibility for the crash, admitting he fell asleep and he will plead guilty at the court. I low-key feel bad for him. When paramedics laid me on the stretcher, I made eye contact with him, and I could tell he was devastated by the look in his eyes. As a photographer, that was a textbook regret written in his face. Dad and bro are now at PD office for report and to give a copy of their dashcam's footage. Friend's almost brand new car has been totaled. I hope they will get a nice compensation. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this, please subscribe.